Okinawa, Pacific Ocean, November 8, 1944, 5:23 a.m. The water is black and warm. Inside the steel cylinder, there is almost no room to move. The pilot sits with his knees pulled toward his chest, his back curved against the curved hull, his face inches from the periscope eyepiece. The smell is fuel and sweat and iron. Outside, 30 feet of Pacific Ocean press against the hull from every direction. He can hear his own breathing. He can hear the tick of the depth gauge. He can hear, faintly, the propeller of the submarine beneath him, the vessel that carried him here, that will release him in a few minutes, that he will never see again. His name is Petty Officer Seikyo Nishina. He is 23 years old. He helped design the weapon he is sitting inside. In approximately 40 minutes, he will be dead. He has known this since the moment he volunteered. This is the Kaiten. The Japanese word means turn of the heavens, or depending on the translation, to change one's fate. It is a torpedo, it is a submarine, it is a coffin, and it is piloted by a man who chose to be here. To understand the Kaiten, you have to understand what Japan faced by mid-1944. The Pacific War had turned. Decisively, irreversibly turned. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the most feared naval force in the Pacific, had suffered catastrophic losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. Aircraft carriers sunk. Experienced pilots gone. The industrial gap between Japan and the United States was no longer a gap. It was a chasm. American supply ships, oil tankers, and troop transports were crossing the Pacific in increasing numbers, protected by destroyer escorts and air cover that conventional Japanese submarines could no longer penetrate. The mathematics of attrition were merciless. Two young naval officers, Lieutenant Hiroshi Kuroki and Lieutenant Seikyo Nishina, proposed a solution that the Imperial Japanese Navy initially refused to consider. They called their design the Kaiten, a Type 93 torpedo modified to carry a pilot in a pressurized cockpit with a manual guidance system and a 1,550-kilogram warhead. The logic was cold and simple. A conventional torpedo could be evaded. A guided torpedo, guided by a human being willing to die, could not. The Type 93 torpedo was already the finest in the world. The Japanese called it the Long Lance, faster, longer-ranged, and more powerful than anything the Americans or British had deployed. It ran on pure oxygen rather than compressed air, leaving no telltale bubble trail on the surface. Now Kuroki and Nishina proposed to put a man inside it. The modifications were extensive. A pressurized cockpit was fitted into the torpedo's midsection, barely large enough to accommodate a seated adult. A periscope, a rudder control, an oxygen supply, an escape hatch, though both designers knew, and every pilot who followed them knew, that the escape hatch was theoretical. At attack speed, against a ship at close range, there was no escape. The warhead was set to detonate on contact. The pilot would feel nothing. The engineering was designed to ensure that. The Imperial Japanese Navy approved the Kaiten program in February 1944. Kuroki and Nishina themselves became the first two instructors. In September 1944, during a training exercise, Lieutenant Kuroki's Kaiten malfunctioned and sank. His body was recovered. Nishina requested, and received, permission to carry Kuroki's ashes into combat with him on the first operational mission. The volunteers came faster than the Navy expected. Young naval officers and enlisted men stepped forward in numbers that surprised even the program's architects. Some came from genuine ideological conviction, the Bushido Code, the concept of Gyokusai, honorable death in the service of the emperor. Others came from something harder to name, peer pressure, the inability to refuse when friends had volunteered, the quiet shame of survival in a war where so many were dying. Some were barely 18 years old. At the Atsushima training base on the inland sea, the pilots practiced in modified torpedoes with reduced warheads, running approach patterns against target ships. They learned to manage oxygen flow, to hold depth, to navigate by periscope in the seconds before impact. They wrote letters home. They composed death poems in the classical Japanese tradition. They were photographed in their uniforms, serious and composed, for portraits their families would keep. You can almost feel the weight of those photographs, the deliberate stillness of young men arranging their faces for posterity. The first Kaiten combat operation launches on November 8, 1944. The target is Ulithi Atoll, a vast American forward naval base in the Caroline Islands, sheltering hundreds of supply ships, tankers, and support vessels. The submarine I-47 carries 4 Kaitens on its outer deck. One of them contains Petty Officer Seikyo Nishina, carrying Lieutenant Kuroki's ashes. At 4 a.m., the 4 pilots enter their Kaitens through internal hatches. The submarine descends to launch depth. One by one, the Kaitens are released. Nishina's Kaiten strikes the fleet oiler USS Mississiniua. The explosion is enormous. The tanker's aviation fuel ignites in a fireball visible for miles. The Mississiniua sinks in 4 hours. 63 American sailors are killed. The Imperial Japanese Navy declares the operation a great victory. Emperor Hirohito sends a personal message of commendation to the Kaiten program. What the Navy does not announce is that 2 of the 4 Kaitens launched that morning never reached their targets. One malfunctioned immediately after launch. One ran off course. The technology was as unreliable as it was lethal. Over the next 10 months, the Japanese Navy launches 15 Kaiten operations involving over 100 pilots. The results are deeply inconsistent. Some operations sink American vessels and inflict real casualties. Many more fail entirely. Kaitens lost to mechanical failure, to evasive maneuvers, to American anti-submarine warfare that grew more effective with every month of the war. The destroyers and destroyer escorts protecting American supply lines were now specifically trained to detect and depth-charge submarines carrying Kaitens. The pilots who died achieved varying degrees of the objective they had chosen death to accomplish. The pilots who died in Kaitens that malfunctioned at depth, or ran in circles, or sank without reaching their targets. They died without even that. The submarines carrying the Kaitens faced their own terrible calculus. A submarine on the surface to launch Kaitens was vulnerable. Several were sunk during operations, their entire crews lost alongside the Kaiten pilots. By 1945, the Americans knew enough about Kaiten operations to route supply convoys around known deployment zones. The weapon was becoming tactically obsolete even as more volunteers stepped forward to pilot it. Japan surrenders on August 15, 1945. At Atsushima Base and at Hikari, another training facility, approximately 100 trained Kaiten pilots receive the news. They are alive. They trained to die. They said their farewells. They composed their death poems. And they are alive. The psychological experience of these survivors is almost impossible to describe. Many spoke in later years of a profound dislocation, of having mentally crossed a threshold from which return was not anticipated, and then being returned anyway. Some described guilt toward the men who had gone before them. Some described relief so overwhelming it produced its own shame. The Kaiten program, in total, killed approximately 80 Japanese pilots. It sank or damaged a small number of American vessels. Measured against the cost in human lives and the investment of naval resources, the strategic impact was negligible. The weapon had not turned the tide. The heavens had not turned. Today, at the Kaiten Memorial Museum on Atsushima Island, you can walk into a full-scale replica of a Kaiten cockpit. It is smaller than you expect. The ceiling is low enough to graze your head. The walls press close on both sides. There is a periscope eyepiece at face level, a rudder lever within reach of the right hand. It smells of metal and time. Visitors stand inside it for a few seconds and then step out, back into the light. The names of the 80 pilots who died in Kaitens are inscribed on a memorial outside. Young names, some barely out of adolescence. Each one a volunteer. Each one carrying the full complexity of what that word means in the context of a militaristic society at war, where to refuse was its own form of disappearance. The Kaiten was not a wonder weapon. It was not a turning point. It was the expression of a military culture that had reached the end of its conventional options and turned, finally, to the one resource it had in abundance: young men willing to believe their deaths could matter. They deserved better strategies. They deserved better leaders. They deserved to come home.